June 1775. The American colonies are on the edge of war. Tensions between Britain and the colonies have been rising for years, and now, after the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, there is no turning back. One of the first great clashes of the American Revolution is about to erupt: the Battle of Bunker Hill. This was not just another battle. It was a moment that tested courage, discipline, and the will of the colonists to stand up against one of the most powerful armies in the world. And although the British claimed victory, the cost was so high that it shook their confidence and inspired the Patriots to keep fighting. In this video, we're diving into 10 important facts about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Each fact reveals not just what happened, but why this battle still matters in history. Fact 1. The battle happened before independence was declared. When we think of the American Revolution, it's easy to imagine the Declaration of Independence already signed, with colonists proudly calling themselves Americans. But in June 1775, that wasn't the case at all. The battle happened over a year before the Declaration of Independence. At this time, many colonists were still hoping for peace. In fact, the Continental Congress had just sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, begging him to stop the fighting and restore harmony. But while that petition was sailing across the Atlantic, the reality on the ground was very different. Skirmishes had already broken out in Massachusetts. Colonists and British soldiers faced each other every day around Boston. Once the fighting began at Bunker Hill, there was no turning back. This is important because it shows the battle wasn't fought by a united group of rebels demanding independence. Instead, it was fought by farmers, shopkeepers, and local militia who were simply defending their homes. They weren't yet sure if they wanted complete independence, but they were sure they didn't want to be pushed around by British soldiers. So when shots rang out at Bunker Hill, it became one of the first major steps toward full independence, even before the famous words of Thomas Jefferson were ever written. Fact 2. It was fought on Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill. Here's a funny twist. The famous Battle of Bunker Hill didn't really happen on Bunker Hill. Most of the fighting actually took place on a nearby hill called Breed's Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts. So why do we call it the Battle of Bunker Hill? Well, that's mostly down to confusion. The colonial commanders originally planned to fortify Bunker Hill, which was the larger of the two. But during the night of June 16th, the militia ended up building their main defenses on Breed's Hill, which was closer to Boston Harbor and more strategically important. When the British woke up the next morning, they were shocked to see fresh fortifications right above the harbor. The colonists had spent the night digging trenches and building earthworks. From there, they could fire cannons directly at British ships. Mistaken naming stuck. Reports at the time, both in America and in Britain, kept calling it the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the name has never changed. But in reality, it was the steep slopes of Breed's Hill where the fiercest fighting happened, where the Redcoats charged 3 times, and where hundreds of men lost their lives. So, in some ways, Battle of Breed's Hill would be the more accurate name. Still, history isn't always tidy, and sometimes mistakes in names become permanent. What matters is not what the battle was called, but how it shaped the Revolutionary War. Fact 3. British Commander General Gage was surrounded. At the time of the battle, Boston was under siege. General Thomas Gage, the British commander, had about 6,000 British soldiers trapped inside the city. Surrounding him were 15,000 New England militia from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. These militia weren't professional soldiers, were farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, ordinary men who had picked up muskets to defend their land. They were angry, motivated, and ready to fight, but they lacked training, supplies, and discipline. Still, their sheer numbers made Boston a dangerous place for the British. Gage and his officers knew that if the militia placed artillery on the surrounding hills, British ships in the harbor would be trapped and the city itself would be lost. That's why the colonists' move to fortify Breed's Hill was so threatening. It wasn't just a bold act. It was a direct challenge to British control of Boston. If the British didn't act fast, they risked losing the city entirely. This situation shows how desperate things had become for the British. They were supposed to be the rulers of the colonies, but here they were, bottled up in one city, surrounded by angry farmers. That imbalance of control set the stage for the bloody clash at Bunker Hill. Fact 4. The militia held the high ground. Military history teaches one simple rule: whoever holds the high ground has the advantage, and in this case the colonists had it. By digging trenches and building fortifications on Breed's Hill, the militia made themselves incredibly hard to dislodge. From those heights, they could fire down on advancing British troops, and they also threatened the harbor below. For the colonists, this was a smart move. Even though they didn't have as many weapons or as much training, the high ground gave them a natural defense. They built fences, stone walls, and earthworks that turned the hill into a fortress. When General Gage and his officers saw this, they knew they couldn't allow it to stand. If the British wanted to break the siege of Boston, they had to take those heights. So, General William Howe, one of Britain's top commanders, was ordered to attack. This shows how strategy mattered just as much as bravery. By choosing the right position, the colonists were able to cause massive casualties. Even though they had fewer resources, the high ground didn't win them the battle, but it allowed them to prove just how dangerous they could be. Fact 5. 3 British attacks were needed. When the British finally attacked on June 17th, they expected a quick victory. After all, they were trained professional soldiers going up against what they called undisciplined rabble. But it wasn't quick at all. The Redcoats launched their first assault up the hill, only to be met with devastating musket fire. The colonists had been ordered not to shoot until they could see the whites of their eyes. This meant every shot counted. The first British attack collapsed with heavy losses. General Howe then ordered a second attack. Once again, the British climbed the hill, and once again, they were cut down by musket fire at close range. Some British units lost half their men, hundreds fell, and the colonists still held the hill. It wasn't until the third attack that the British finally broke through. And even then, it was only because the militia had run out of ammunition. Exhausted and unable to reload, the colonists were forced to retreat. This fact is critical because it shows how hard the British had to fight just to take one hill. Instead of proving the colonists were weak, the battle showed the world that ordinary Americans could stand up to the world's strongest army. Fact 6. Colonial ammunition ran out. The militia had the courage, they had the high ground. They even had strong defenses. But they didn't have one of the most important things in war: ammunition. Many colonial fighters only had a handful of musket balls. Some had as few as 9 rounds each. That meant every shot had to count, and it's why they waited until the British were practically on top of them before firing. In the chaos of battle, resupply was impossible. Reinforcements stood waiting on Bunker Hill, but they couldn't get enough powder or ammunition to the men on Breed's Hill in time. When the British launched their third attack, the militia's powder finally ran out. Many men had nothing left but rocks, clubs, or the butts of their muskets. Against British bayonets, they didn't stand a chance. This shortage of ammunition turned the tide of the battle. Without it, the colonists couldn't keep holding the line, no matter how brave they were. It also taught the Americans a harsh lesson. Courage wasn't enough. If they were going to win their independence, they needed weapons, gunpowder, and real supplies. This is why later victories like capturing Fort Ticonderoga and its 59 cannons were so important for the Revolution. Fact 7. British victory was very costly. On paper, the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill. They drove the colonists off the hill and claimed the ground. But in reality, it was a Pyrrhic victory, a win that cost so much it felt like a loss. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties, about 200 killed, and more than 800 wounded. That was almost half the men who fought in the battle. Some units were nearly destroyed. By comparison, the colonists lost about 450 men. That was still a heavy loss, but nowhere near what the British endured. And because the colonists had been forced to retreat only after running out of ammunition, they saw the battle as proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with the Redcoats. British commanders were shocked. They had expected an easy win. Instead, they learned that fighting the colonists would be brutal and costly. As General Henry Clinton famously said afterward, a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. This fact reminds us that in war, winning a battle doesn't always mean winning the war. Sometimes the cost of victory is too high to recover from. Fact 8. Joseph Warren became a martyr. One of the most important losses for the Patriots that day was Dr. Joseph Warren. Warren wasn't just any soldier. He was a respected doctor, a political leader, and the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. He had recently been appointed a major general, but when the fighting broke out, he chose to fight as a common soldier in the ranks. During the final British assault, Warren stayed in the redoubt until the last possible moment. He was killed in the chaos, and his body was later identified by friends. For the Patriots, his death was devastating, but also inspiring. Warren became one of the first great martyrs of the Revolution, a symbol of sacrifice for the cause of liberty. His courage showed that leaders weren't hiding behind desks. They were willing to fight and die alongside their men. That kind of example gave the revolution a moral power that the British could never match. Fact 9. A Pyrrhic victory inspired the colonists. Even though they lost the ground, the colonists didn't see Bunker Hill as a defeat. They saw it as proof that they could fight. The British Army was considered the best in the world, professional, disciplined, and unbeatable. But at Bunker Hill, that myth was shattered. The colonists had stood their ground against 3 assaults and only retreated when they ran out of ammunition. This boosted morale across the colonies. News of the battle spread quickly, and people realized that the revolution had a real chance. Farmers and townsmen could stand up to redcoats and live to tell the tale. In many ways, Bunker Hill turned the revolution from a rebellion into a war. It convinced thousands of colonists to take up arms, and it helped convince leaders like George Washington that victory was possible. So while the British claimed victory, the psychological victory belonged to the Patriots. Fact 10. The battle set the stage for the war ahead. The Battle of Bunker Hill was indeed just a single clash. It shaped the entire course of the war that followed. For the British, it was a warning. They could no longer underestimate the colonists. Every battle would be costly, every town would be hard to hold, and supplies would always be stretched thin. For the Americans, it was a turning point. The battle showed the need for better supplies, stronger leadership, and a real army. That's why, just weeks later, George Washington arrived to take command of the Continental Army. It also deepened the divide between the colonies and Britain. When news of the battle reached London, it hardened the king's position. By August, King George III had declared the colonies to be an open rebellion. From this point on, there was no going back. The Olive Branch Petition was ignored, reconciliation was impossible, and the fight for independence became the only option. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the war would be long, bloody, uncertain. But it also showed that freedom was worth the fight. The Battle of Bunker Hill was more than just an early clash of the American Revolution. It was a test of courage, of strength, of determination. The colonists may have lost the hill, but they gained something far greater. The belief that they could stand up to Britain and win. That belief carried them through years of hardship, through battles and retreats, all the way to victory and independence. And that's why this battle, fought on a hill in Massachusetts in June 1775, still echoes in history as one of the most important moments of the American Revolution.